There is much to love about North and South Carolina, but the two states have also had their fair share of violent and senseless crimes over the years. From murders on the Blue Ridge Parkway, in the heart of big cities or sleepy college towns, and along the coastal waters, some of these stories may be new to you. Some may have happened in your town. Some may involve people that are still missing to this day. But all will leave you remembering to always be vigilant about the people you meet and the places you go. I'm Renee Roberson. Please join me for Missing in the Carolinas. Episode 122, The Year in Review for Missing in the Carolinas. Well, if you're like me, you no longer know what day it is during this holiday season. This past year has been a hectic one, and due to a lot of different factors, I decided to take a break from producing new episodes after Thanksgiving to regroup and give myself a break to spend time with family. I did still want to create an end-of-year wrap-up for the podcast, so this will close out 2024. This episode is beneficial because it helps me take a closer look at what episodes performed the best and what platforms showed the most growth. This past year, I continued producing weekly episodes, while for most of 2023, I was on a bi-weekly production schedule. I'm not going to lie. Being the only member of my podcast team, it's been challenging to write and produce most of the scripts solo. I did have some help from my daughter when she was home from college this past summer, so shout out to Mia Roberson for her assistance. Another exciting thing has happened, and I think this podcast directly impacted that. I've mentioned before that I've written a suspense thriller novel that I have a really good feeling about. After collaborating with a developmental editor earlier this year, I began querying literary agents to see if they would be interested in learning more about the book. I've done this before with other novels I've written, and to be honest, never gotten much interest. It's a difficult process because for every agent you contact, you have to send a pitch letter, sample chapters, and anything else they request. Every agent wants something different, so this is a time-consuming process, as is finding agents who are looking for the type of material that you write. This past spring, I began reaching out to agents with my novel titled It's a Miracle I'm Alive. The book is about a true crime podcaster who is trying to solve the disappearance of her older sister. It's told through alternating points of view, diary entries, news articles, and podcast transcripts. I've had 3 different agents request to read the book, and I think this podcast helped generate their interest. While I have not received an offer of representation yet, I'm hopeful I will find an agent in the new year. I've also spent some of my time off from Missing in the Carolinas creating a comprehensive outline for a new novel, so that has been invigorating. Another amazing thing that happened was that a representative from the show Dateline Missing in America reached out to me and asked if I wanted to participate in a promo swap. This was an opportunity for me to run a short ad for our show for free, and in return, we ran one for them for an equal amount of impressions. I hope to do even more of these types of podcast swaps in the future. Now let's talk podcast stats. Analyzing download numbers has always been a little difficult because every podcast platform presents them in a different way. I do know that listeners consume the podcast mostly on Spotify and not as much on Apple Podcasts, which are my 2 main platforms. SoundCloud is our podcast host, and it appears the numbers it shows are a combination between the Spotify and Apple Podcast listeners. Missing in the Carolinas released 42 new episodes this year. We'll talk about Spotify stats first. The show has 8,228 followers on the platform. It's now been streamed more than 570,000 times. In 2024, the show increased its followers by 16%. 49% of the listeners are new this year. The first episode, 3 Mysteries in the Carolinas, has been streamed 326% more than the average episode. The show was streamed in 63 countries, the U.S. being the top country. People who listen to Missing in the Carolinas also listen to Dateline NBC, 48 Hours, Crime Junkie, Murder in America, and Case File True Crime. 37% of listeners are 55 and older, 28% are 45 to 54, 22% are 35 to 44. 85.3% of listeners are female, 11.4% are male, and 3.3% are not specified. In audiobooks, they listen to mystery and thriller, true crime, and romance genres. We're a top show for 1,600 fans on Spotify. The average podcast rating is 4.4 stars. Here's a look at the top 5 episodes downloaded from 2024 on Spotify. Episode 87, Missing and Murdered in Columbia, South Carolina, received 2,386 streams, which means the episode was played for at least 60 seconds. Episode 87 discussed different crimes from the Columbia area of South Carolina. This includes 20-year-old Mike O'Boyle, who was murdered in the spring of 1980, and 65-year-old Jack Robinson, who was stabbed to death at a boat landing near the South Carolina Fairgrounds in 1996. I also discussed Paula Merchant, a college graduate who went missing in January of 1999 after becoming addicted to drugs as a coping mechanism for debilitating migraines. The episode concluded with the still unsolved mystery of Shelton Sanders, a University of South Carolina student who went missing in 2001 after visiting the home of a friend. Here's a clip from the episode. Next, I want to talk about a young woman named Paula Louise Merchant, because I came across her case while I was reading about Mike O'Boyle. Paula went missing from Forest Acres, South Carolina on Sunday, January 3, 1999. The 25-year-old was last seen by her parents that evening around 6:30 p.m. when she left their home on Sandy Ridge Road to head to a church near the Columbia-Owens downtown airport. Police found her 1989 Nissan Sentra on Commerce Drive behind an abandoned building in the early morning hours of January 4th. Paula's parents filed a missing persons report later that morning. It appeared the car had been burned deliberately, and unlike when Mike O'Boyle went missing, investigators told media they were concerned about foul play. Paula had recently graduated from Georgia State University and had moved back home to stay with her parents while she applied to graduate school for anthropology. Paula's older brother told the local media he believed drugs may have played a role in Paula's disappearance. She had suffered debilitating migraines for years, and while her doctors had been unable to help her, he said she had become dependent on drugs for help with managing the pain. She had gone through rehab while in college. Investigators said her car was found in an area that was known to be frequented by heroin dealers. Her purse was found in the car, with the keys still in the ignition. The church she had been heading to that night was the site of a Narcotics Anonymous meeting. Investigators attended a meeting of the group and talked to people there. By all accounts, no one could confirm Paula had made it to the NA meeting that evening before she went missing. At the time she disappeared, Paula Louise Merchant was a Caucasian woman with strawberry blonde hair and brown eyes. She stood 5 feet 6 inches tall and weighed around 120 pounds. She was wearing a green sweater, navy coat, gray pants, black shoes, and a dark pink knitted hat, along with a large silver ring on one hand. Anyone with information on the case is asked to call the Richland County Sheriff's Department at 803-576-3000. There is a reward being offered for information leading to an arrest in this case. Episode 85, Denise Durham, Shelby Wilkie, and Marissa Carmichael received 2,460 streams. This episode featured 2 murders that have since been solved and the disappearance of a young mother in Greensboro who went missing earlier this year. Denise Durham was a 16-year-old high school student in East Flat Rock, North Carolina, when she was murdered unexpectedly, shocking their small community. The perpetrator was even more shocking. He was a 64-year-old former Broadway performer who was also Denise's vocal coach. 38-year-old Shelby Wilkie went missing in the Hendersonville-Asheville area in early January of 2012, and police soon zeroed in on her husband Michael as a suspect. Shelby had become trapped in an abusive marriage and was struggling to leave because she and her husband were also the parents of a 3-month-old daughter at the time. When she went missing, her coworkers and friends and family knew she wouldn't have left without telling anyone where she was because they had been helping her plan an official separation from Michael. In January of this year, 25-year-old Marissa Carmichael went to a nightclub with some friends in Greensboro and sometime in the early morning hours tried to call 911 from an Exxon station. The people she'd been with had left her at the gas station and her phone was still in their car. When officers arrived a short time later, the store clerk said Marissa had left with someone already. Marissa is the mother of 5 young children and her family is still looking for her, and the alleged friends she was with that night aren't talking. Here's a clip from the episode. Shelby had a bubbly personality and truly believed in the institution of marriage, according to her family. After only a few months of dating, Michael proposed to Shelby and they were married on October 10, 2010. But according to court records and interviews with her family, Michael's true personality came out as soon as they were married. During an argument, he blocked her from leaving the house, damaged her car door, and tried to yank her wedding rings off her finger. Shaken, she filed a restraining order against him the next day, but according to her family, he begged for her forgiveness until she agreed to drop the charges. But Shelby's friends and family knew things weren't getting any better. They could tell her husband was trying to isolate her. He refused to set up a joint bank account and even insisted she pay for her own food when they went out for meals. Shelby came into work at the Asheville Radio Group, where she was an assistant business manager, with bruises she tried to hide. According to an article that ran in the Times News in Hendersonville, the couple had another serious fight about 6 months into their marriage, where he tried to restrain her from leaving the house and took the phone away from her to prevent her from calling 911. She filed another restraining order, but ultimately made the decision to drop that one too, because she discovered she was pregnant and wanted to make the marriage work for the sake of their child. Not long after Sydney was born, Shelby had to face facts that Michael was not the man she thought he was, and she could not live with his volatile temper and mood swings. She hired an attorney to draw up a separation agreement and secretly leased the home in Black Mountain in November of 2011. She quietly continued to live with Michael, go to work, and raise Sydney until she could tell him she was leaving at the first of the year. Episode 83, James Chambers, Cole Thomas, and Sydney West, received 2,394 streams. In 2018, a man confessed to the murder of North Carolina resident James Chambers, but his body has never been found. Cole Thomas had joined a work crew up north when he traveled to North Carolina in 2016 with some coworkers, but he got caught up in a drug deal he didn't want to be involved in once they arrived. His coworkers have had conflicting stories about what happened to Cole, and the case has taken many twists and turns. North Carolina resident Sydney West moved to California to attend her dream college, but struggled emotionally during the pandemic. In 2020, she was caught on camera visiting the Golden Gate Bridge, but what happened after that is something her parents haven't been able to determine. In August 2014, a 28-year-old man named James Allen Chambers III went missing from his home in Fayetteville, North Carolina. At the time, he was working as a civilian construction worker on the Army base at Fort Bragg. His former girlfriend told investigators he had left with a friend named Howard Ashelman. Supposedly, Howard was going to drive James to a weekend lifeguard job at a lake outside of town. But when he never returned, his family grew worried and reported him missing. The following information was shared by staff writers Jack Bowden and Paul Wolverton with the Fayetteville Observer. Investigators immediately suspected Howard Ashelman was involved in James's disappearance, but didn't have enough evidence that he knew where James was. With no sign of James or proof that he had come to harm, the case went cold. But Howard later moved to Florida, got married, and began studies at a Bible college. With the guilt weighing on him, he told his wife that he had murdered James and disposed of his body. Over several different conversations, which his wife recorded at least once, he gave more details. She then shared the information with police in Florida. They interviewed him but did not arrest him. He retained a public defender from Cumberland County and began negotiating with Fayetteville law enforcement to plead guilty and surrender in January of 2017. But the investigation hit a snag. Law enforcement officers said they were still collecting evidence and were not ready to arrest Howard. They didn't want to jeopardize their case. Howard was expected to surrender later that year, but the negotiation stalled. He was finally arrested in February 2018 and charged with robbery and murder. Howard Ashelman claimed he and James Chambers had a contentious relationship, and they had gotten into an argument on August 15, 2014. Howard said he stopped the truck, took a gun from the truck bed, and fired into the cab. He said he only meant to scare James, but the bullet struck and killed him instead. Howard confessed to a local drug dealer later that night that he had money from a dead man. Authorities later found that dealer and corroborated those statements. During his confession, he said he burned and buried James's body in Cumberland County and then grew paranoid it would be found in the Wade area of the county. So he dug up James's remains, dismembered them, put them in plastic garbage bags, drove to a bridge over a waterway, and dropped them over the side into the Cape Fear River. He then took his truck to a salvage yard and had it crushed. 8 days after his arrest, Howard Ashelman pled guilty to second-degree murder and was sentenced to at least 15 years, 6 months, but no more than 19 years, 8 months in prison. He is currently serving his sentence at the Columbus Correctional Institution in Whiteville. As part of his plea, he agreed to show investigators where he disposed of James's body. He said he knows it was a bridge in a remote area, but can't remember exactly where. A recent episode of Dateline titled The Bridge shared details of the case and the search for James. He still has not been found. Episode 81, National Stalking Awareness Month and Peggy Klinke's story, received 2,402 streams. I interviewed Debbie Riddle, whose sister Peggy was murdered by her ex-boyfriend in 2003. Peggy realized her relationship with Patrick Kennedy was not healthy, and she tried to do everything right, filing restraining orders and even moving to another state to get away from him. Unfortunately, this story illustrates how determined stalkers can be, and Peggy's sister became an advocate for stalking awareness and changing the way law enforcement and legislation handles the crime of stalking.
So what was interesting about this relationship is, Peggy began dating Patrick, and it was very, I guess, textbook dating at the beginning. We would talk about like, oh, he had asked her out to dinner, or they had gone to the movies, or they had, gone on some outdoor adventure, hiking or whatever. And there really wasn't too much concern, but this was in the fall. So when Peggy had come home for Christmas, we had already knew about this guy that she was dating, and but we didn't know how much Peggy had told him about her life, where she lived, what her family was like. And right before Christmas, this man shows up on my mother's front doorstep. Now, mind you, he's from Albuquerque. We live in Ohio. This was long before the age of the internet. So how do you find out where someone lives? And my family lived in a pretty small town in Ohio. So that to me was a huge red flag. Like, what are you doing here? How did you find my mother's address? When I opened that door and Peggy was standing behind me on the stairs looking at him, and he said, "Hey, I'm here to surprise you for the holidays." And I turned around, and the look on my sister's face was not only one of surprise, but a little shocked. And I'm sure she had kind of that same process in her head, like, how did you know where my mother lived?
Earlier this year, a young boy died at a wilderness therapy camp in the North Carolina mountains. His death ignited an ongoing investigation into the facility, and I realized a 17-year-old young man had also died in 2014 while out on an excursion with Trails Carolina. Episode 88, The Deaths at Trails Carolina, received 2,496 streams. Here's a clip. A Department of Health and Human Services report investigating the death of Alec Lansing showed a deputy with the local sheriff's department said staff at Trails Carolina waited 5 hours after the young man had gone missing to call for help. The deputy told DHHS that they believed they would have had a better chance finding Alec alive if they had begun the search earlier. Trails Carolina was fined $12,000, but was allowed to keep operating. I noticed something else when learning about Alec. There are several conflicting dates about when he went missing. Some articles said November 17th. Others said November 10th. November 10th makes sense to me because one of the articles I found in the Asheville Citizen-Times was published on November 15th and said he'd been missing for several days already. He was found on November 24th, according to the published reports. His obituary said he died on November 22nd. I'm assuming it was hard to estimate exactly how long he had been dead because of the conditions outside, but I hope he wasn't in the water for 10 to 12 days before he succumbed to his injuries. Did his group take even longer to report him missing than what was published? The most important question is, why was Alec so determined to leave the group? He wasn't the only one who had escaped it before, seemingly out of desperation. Before we continue, let's take a quick break for a word from our sponsors. It's wintertime. I don't know about you, but my skin is always in desperate need of moisture during this time of year. And, well, all the other months of the year too. But I don't like to experiment with a lot of different products at high price points if they won't work for me. Enter the products from Skinx Erin. I use her Pre-Cleanse Oil, Hydrating Beauty Oil, and Perfecting Night Oil, and I was hooked from the first drop. The Pre-Cleanse gently removes dirt, impurities, and even waterproof makeup without tugging, all without stripping or drying out your skin. In addition to keeping your skin clear, it also helps your skin feel firmer and reduces the signs of aging. The Hydrating Beauty Oil is a powerful and effective skin hydrator that never leaves your skin feeling greasy. The signature squalene oil is known for its anti-inflammatory and anti-aging properties. It's perfect for treating skin conditions like acne and eczema and reducing the appearance of wrinkles. The Perfecting Night Oil is loaded with vitamins E and A and is rich with antioxidants and omegas that nourish skin, replenish elasticity, and reduce stretch marks. A few drops a day leave skin feeling smoother, more vibrant, and youthful. Want to try out the products for yourself? Go to shopxerin.com and use the code MissingCarolinas10 for a 10% discount on your order. Are you looking to level up your writing or learn a new skill? Whether you focus on nonfiction or are more inclined to creative writing or want to learn how to put together a digital portfolio of your writing, Wow Women on Writing can help. Interested in podcasting? Check out a digital course I created called You Can Start a Podcast. During this pre-recorded webinar, you will learn the benefits of creating your own podcast, materials you need to get started, how to develop content that will keep listeners coming back for more, and ways your podcast can create supplemental income. I'll share examples of different types of podcasts, how to decide on a format, ways to handle the technology necessary for creating a podcast, how to develop your first few episodes, promotion and monetization ideas, and ways you can repurpose your podcast content. All written materials and resources are provided by me. I'll provide a handout with information discussed in the webinar, along with suggestions for a few different types of podcasts to explore. Best of all, this webinar only costs $30. You can find it by going to wow-womenonwriting.com and clicking on the Classroom tab. I'll also post a link in the show notes. And now, let's get back to the show. Let's talk stats from Apple Podcasts now. Followers are 2,000 as opposed to the almost 9,000 on Spotify. The average podcast rating is 4.7 stars. The top cities for this podcast are Charlotte, Atlanta, Nashville, Chicago, and Birmingham. The Apple Podcast top episodes were a little different from the Spotify streams. For Apple, the top 5 were Episode 106, The Little Rascals Daycare Case, Episode 105, Missing and Murdered in the High Country, Episode 111, The Murder of Jenny Gray and the Abduction of Lee Cooper in Boone, Episode 103, The Mysterious Life and Death of Doris Duke, and Episode 107, Eric Rudolph, The Escape, Part 1. My son headed off to college at Appalachian State University this year, so naturally I became interested in some unsolved crimes and disappearances in that area. I shared the story of Martin Roberts, the student who went missing from Boone in April of 2016, in the early days of the podcast on Episode 8. For Episode 111, I shared the story of Jenny Gray and Lee Cooper, 2 Boone residents who crossed paths with a malicious man named Daniel Bryan Lee. Here's a clip from that episode. Women in the community became fearful after Jenny went missing. This was not a woman who would have left on her own. She was likely out exercising when she vanished. There were no signs pointing to her leaving suddenly on her own. Female students at App State and other local women were warned by the police not to run or walk alone and to implement a buddy system whenever they could. 7 days later, on October 1st, 1989, the local media reported that a 24-year-old local man named Daniel Bryan Lee had been arrested and charged with rape, 3 counts of first-degree sexual offense, kidnapping, and armed robbery. His bond was set at $3 million. Sheriff James Lyons said the kidnapping had occurred in Boone, but the assault had occurred outside of town. At first, residents thought the arrest was tied to Jenny Gray. But if that was the case, why had she still not been found? Residents soon learned the latest victim was not Jenny Gray, and she still remained missing. The sheriff also would not tell the public if Daniel Lee's alleged victim had been an App State student or employee. The media dug up all the information they could about the suspect. Daniel Brian Lee was a local who had attended Watauga High School and earned a high school equivalency certificate from Caldwell Community College. His father, Jacob, told the press that his son worked as a dishwasher at Blowing Rock Hospital and that he wasn't sure what had happened after police took his son in for questioning. He mentioned Daniel had undergone brain surgery about 15 months earlier after doctors discovered he had an aneurysm. To the public, it appeared that the Boone Police Department wasn't yet convinced the rape of this new Boone victim was tied to Jenny Gray's disappearance. The police chief, R. Zane Tester, said, "We are still looking at other options regarding Jenny Gray being missing, but obviously this arrest is leading us in a direction too." In addition to missing persons cases, this year I wanted to take a deep dive into a variety of historical topics, tangentially related to true crime in our area, and these episodes included the following episodes during the summer months. Episode 109, Jim and Tammy Faye Baker and the PTL Scandal. Episodes 107 and 108, The Escape and Capture of Eric Rudolph. Episode 106, The Little Rascals Daycare Case. Episode 103, The Mysterious Life and Death of Doris Duke. One of the most intriguing episodes I wrote this year was episode 84, The Business of Body Brokers. I first got the idea for this story after listening to another podcast series called Cover Up Body Brokers, about a funeral director in Colorado who sold body parts and tissue from her deceased clientele, often lying to their loved ones and giving them fake cremains in return. I also discovered a North Carolina man named Philip Guyette operated as a body broker in our state for several years before eventually being convicted of mail fraud. I felt like the public needed to be educated on the differences between organ donations and donating one's body to science. Here's a clip. What is a body broker and how do they operate? According to an investigative series by the news organization Reuters, body brokers are also known as non-tissue transplant banks. These banks are different from the organ and tissue industry, which is highly regulated. No federal law currently governs the sale of cadavers or body parts for use in research or education. In 2004, a federal health advisory panel called for regulation of body brokers. That panel asked the U.S. government to apply the same oversights to the body parts trade that governs organ transplantation. The panel's efforts resulted in nothing. How and whether or not a state regulates the industry is left up to each individual state. A graphic published in the Reuters investigative series shows exactly how the industry works. Below are the steps. Number 1. Body brokers solicit donors online through funeral homes, hospices, and hospitals. Donors are told they will contribute to science and receive a free or discounted cremation. Number 2, a donor can sign a consent form giving their body to a broker before dying, or next of kin can sign the form after death. Number 3, after death, the broker assesses the body's medical history and physical condition, weight, surgical implants, scars, and tests it for infectious disease. Number 4, the broker either retains the whole cadaver or dissects it. Most bodies are cut into 6 parts, such as the head, torso, arms, and legs. Number 5. If requested, a portion of the body not sold for research and education is cremated within weeks and returned to next of kin. Number 6. A broker's clients, such as a medical device company, submits an order for body parts. For example, a surgical training seminar may request 27 elbows. Number 7. The broker assesses its inventory, provides a price quote for the body parts, and if accepted, sells or rents the body parts to the client. Number 8. Rented body parts are returned to the broker for potential reuse. Body parts sold to clients are cremated after research or training and disposed. The Reuters series pointed out that there is no national registry of body brokers. Much of the time, they can operate quietly, behind their company names that usually include the words tissue or donor in them, and make deals to obtain cadavers and sell their parts. That same investigation discovered that the U.S. Army used heads, arms, and legs from more than 20 bodies in blast experiments in 2012 and 2013, despite the fact that the donors had not given them permission to do so. Listeners responded to this episode much like I did. Tracy Owens wrote on Facebook, "This was an interesting episode, very informative." The account Breakfast with Bimbos wrote on Instagram, "I've never thought about this before." I also wanted to highlight some nice reviews the podcast received on Apple Podcasts this year. Steph wrote, "I discovered this podcast a few months ago and I really enjoy it. Between the two states, there is a ton of cases to talk about, although they really can break your heart. I recently listened to a multi-story episode that featured Crystal Todd from South Carolina. I remember that case very well. I've watched the Unsolved Mysteries episode on her case many times. It's a very cruel world. I appreciate you taking the time to share these with us and all your hard work. Can't wait for more. Be safe, everyone." Younger CEO wrote, "Excellent regional true crime podcast by someone intimately familiar and invested in the cases. Variety of cases covered means you get lots of different topics and it never gets cookie cutter or stagnant. Cannot recommend more highly." Again, I want to thank all the listeners of this podcast this year who've helped it achieve enormous growth, and I'm really looking forward to what is to come in 2025. This brings us to the conclusion of this episode of Missing in the Carolinas. I hope you've enjoyed hearing some of the behind-the-scenes stories about how these episodes are developed and which shows have received the most attention so far. I'll be back with new episodes in January. In the meantime, I created a series of videos on Instagram and Facebook titled 12 Days of True Crime Podcasts, where I shared podcasts from my own personal feed. Check that out if you haven't yet, and I'm sure you'll find some fun new shows to binge in the meantime. Happy New Year. If you enjoyed this episode, please do me a favor and give it a 5-star rating wherever you listen to your podcasts. We're also on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, so please like our pages and get started on a discussion of the missing people profiled on the show. Do you know of a missing persons case in North or South Carolina that you think should be covered? Email me at missinginthecarolinas@gmail.com with any details you can share. And don't forget to check out our sponsor, Wow Women on Writing, and the great programs and writing contests they have to support writers at wow-womenonwriting.com. Cover art for this podcast was designed by Macintosh Multimedia. All episodes are researched and written by me, Renee Roberson, with sound editing provided by Mia and Daniel Roberson. Thanks so much for listening.